Hello. Hi. All right, welcome. Yeah. So, how are we doing this morning? All right. Jess will be available later in the meeting. Barshan and Kavya, hello. And Morgan, hello.
Hello.
Hi. So we
Yeah.
didn't have an open source meeting yesterday. I don't know if you had an
Yeah.
update to give.
I joined yesterday. I actually prepared a UI for the cell feed. I showed it to Morgan. He was there.
Okay.
We discussed a few things. So I plan to show it today as well.
Okay.
I'll just share my screen. Look, so basically, I'll just give an overview first. So the data which Epic had all the phenotypes mentioned. So the fates were not classified in it. So for that, in the GitHub, I saw a CSV file which I think Mehul uploaded a while back. Like I was searching for the data, a labeling sort of thing, so that I can get all the ABA or the long, uh, like long name of the cell into a specific fate. Like I can classify it. So I found the CSV in there, and so I connected that CSV with the current classification uh, thing and like the names, and I ran the model over those again. So I got around 64% accuracy in 35 steps epochs. So like for now it's good enough. Like 65% is good enough. Like some of the cells are very rare, so the model is struggling to predict those. But I'll show the UI right now. One second. Okay, so the UI is vibe coded basically. So I generated all the data, and this the UI I vibe coded it out of it. So it's a very interactive UI. So this is it's visible, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So if I start it, like the time step goes from 0 to 219 or whatever the embryo is. So so it shows the mitosis as well, like how the cells are uh, changing, and we can zoom into them as well, like this. So as you can see over here, I can just pause it. So over there, there's a red boundary on this specific cell. So with that means that the model couldn't predict it properly. Like on over this cell, there's a boundary, like a red boundary against it. So that means so if I click on that cell, you can see here that so it predicted that this cell was actually a Farnex, but its actual true fate was a neuron. And so the verdict was missed, and we can also see the parent and the time step at which the cell existed. And we again start like over here. We can also, like, if we just want to see the neuron cells, we can also uh, see that like these are only the neuron cells, and we can like categorize those according to what cells we want to view or analyze. So you can see like most of them are predicted, but there are like 30% of them which it's a miss basically. So the model predicted that this was a muscle, but it's actually a germline. So this is also there. So after that, these are the explainable things. So which features drive each fate? Like for the neuron, the coordinates basically were the most useful in understanding if the fate was neuron or not. The blot was not useful at all. Like it's basically the fluorescence of the like the capture fluorescence when it was captured. So it was not that useful. So that's why it's completely zero, because it's not. It couldn't correlate at all with why the fate is predicted that way. And next we have the size and all. Like it's different for different different one of the like part of the cells. And we also have the tissue to tissue contact, like the contacting with each other, like neuron is connected to 1067 neuron cells, and we can see the model performance over here, like how it increased. Like it was like 40% when I started it, and it increased to around 65%. So maybe if I can run it for like 100 epochs, maybe it will go to like 60, 75 or something. So that's it. Like it's very interactive as well. If you want to check one single cell, we can also check that. We can hover over it, and yeah. So the SGL is the model predicted this, I think, very nicely. Other than the other one, like if it was mutated or non-mutated, the cell fate went well because the labels were pre-decided and we had actual data onto it.
Right. Yeah, that looks good. So this can be, so you have tissue fates, and of course the fluorescence didn't predict that because they're all the markers aren't specific to the tissue fate. It's just,
Yeah.
yeah. But then you have, actually, it brings up a good question. I wonder if maybe for future work, we could have like a gene expression data set underlying it and plug those in for each cell. Or I know there are data sets where you can do that, but it would be interesting.
Okay.
And then this is nice, this map. So these are just the different cells. And
Of a specific embryo. Then we can run it again for a different embryo.
You could do this for any one of the specific embryos, or just...
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
We can do it for any of them.
Oh. Could you, could you reconstruct the graph here? I mean, could you have, a way to plot the graph and then explore it? Like, what I'm thinking about is there different parts of the graph, you have...
So basically, if we select a specific fate, then it will put on a graph as to how it led to that fate. That kind of a graph, is it?
Okay.
Or do we want a testing accuracy type graph, like evaluation type graph?
All right. Yeah. Yeah. We'll have to take a look at that some more. It's definitely good. Yeah. So you vibe coded this?
Yeah, the UI. Yeah, I gave it I wanted this way and everything.
It's nice. Yeah, that looks good. Do we have any questions for Barshan on that? That's nice work. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll upload this this week.
Okay, yeah.
This UI with the data, new data set and everything, the links and everything.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then as for so that's your update. That's what you've been doing, obviously, and working with the new data sets. What are your plan? What's your plan for the next week or next 2 weeks?
One thing I was thinking, if we can just select a fate and then just how in Napari they used to put a path of a cell and how it led to that. We can highlight a path and how it led to it. Something like that was explainable. I would try to look into that. This is a simple model running in due to the labeling.
Yeah, it just has the labeling and some of the other data underlying it. But you could replace that with sort of the information about the lineage tree. I mean, I know you have the nomenclature, but the actual connections, this cell is the mother of these daughter cells, or just a network relation.
Yeah, the parents are also mentioned in this. If I select a specific cell, the parent will also be mentioned over here.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Which was the previous parent. I'm still trying on putting this demo over into a web page or something where it is available for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be good. So maybe a web app, something like that.
Yeah,
where you can upload an embryo.
Yeah, could you do that off of GitHub.io, or could you have to go to
No, I can go do that off GitHub.io. Yes.
Okay, yeah. we've had like some tools in the past where we've created them like different places, and the terms of the hosting changed over time. Yeah.
I don't think GitHub IO will run out of usage, so it will be deployed.
Okay.
So maybe I'll put in upload your file, like you can upload the embryo CSV or whatever, and then it will analyze it and give you output like this, where you can go through it and analyze itself and how it moves.
Okay. Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. All right. So that's good. Thank you, Barshan, for that update and the hard work there. And looks like things are going pretty well. I don't know if Kavya had an update. I know last time we had a meeting, he had his document there. It's pretty extensive document, and we had a pretty good discussion on developmental agents.
Actually, I could not do much after it. That means I was occupied with. I've been working with a very small startup, which is building kind of a desk robot, like MO or something.
Yeah.
So it's a bit occupied, but yeah, I've been looking into some simulation work or some tooling for active inference. I could just find PyMDP library, which is quite famous for active inference. Um, but I also looked into Active Inference Institute, but it's quite overwhelming. Yeah. The resources out there on the YouTube is overwhelming. It's pretty much theoretical, not much on the simulation side of things.
Yeah.
So, do you have any idea about any tooling for active inference, or is PyMDP enough?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, PyMDP is like one of the major tools. Like their toolboxes for active inference. There are also some platforms for active inference that we talked about in the past meetings. But yeah, you'd have to go through and see which one works best for you. I would just start with like doing stuff in Python with PyMDP and kind of laying out some of the things that you want to look at, and then moving to one of the more advanced ways to do it. And Morgan looks like he wants to say something.
Well, I was just I'm just gonna drop in the chat the spinning up in Alf. Might have some good references.
Okay. Yeah. Let's see.
There might be a lot of things you've seen before. What's his name out in Alexander Shaw in Exeter?
Right.
Like it's like, is it CP Lab? Anyway, I'll see if I can find. He's dropping cool simulation implementations.
Yeah.
Or like
Yeah.
example implementations.
So this is modeled on OpenAI spinning up reinforcement learning, and then this is spinning up, I guess, active inference. So this is
Yeah. I've used that theme, right? Because
yeah.
I've got spinning up in PDEs and I got spinning up in mech interpretation.
Yeah. So we saw this here where the curriculum that you have, but the tools, of course, are
Well, these are all supposed to be like those aren't just tutorials, but they should be like code tutorials.
okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm just taking a look. Oh, this is the active inference resource page here, or the section. So this is modules 9 through 12, the core AI F track. So we have PyMDP here, which is a library. We have SPM DEM toolbox. That's Friston's MATLAB toolbox. I mean, that's, if you're not using MATLAB, it's kind of, you might as well go with PyMDP. There's RxInfer, which of course is this Julia package. This is just, well, there's a lot of stuff, good stuff in here for like message passing and working with robots, hidden Markov model training. There's active inference in Julia. Go ahead.
And yeah, and Daniel now, or plus the kind of like the textbook group, they've got tutorials going through the new tutorial from the versus guy. It's like fundamentals of active inference or something like that. Anyway, hopefully those are useful. Definitely, I should update spinning up and out.
Yeah, I think it would be nice. Yeah, we'll just kind of make this part of the lab too. I should fork this repository. So yeah, I'll do that later. Yeah, this is good work, having all these resources here. But you see, this is what the state of the toolboxes are. So this is where we have RxInfer, and we have T-mazes and RxInfer, which of course, if you're doing like choice in like an agent model, you have T-mazes, you have active inference JL, and then you have you have the courses and you have the tools. But in terms of the tools, it's basically you have some Python tools and then you have some standalone packages. And so those are just going through and kind of figuring out which one is best. I would just start with the Python toolkit first. And then, of course, yeah, the Active Inference Institute has a lot of tutorials and like things from the symposium last year and the year before. There, where they actually do have walkthroughs on some of the tools. Maybe not like deep coursework type tutorials, but like they have like just showing off how to use the tools and what they're about. So that's all there. I mean, there's a lot of there's this tendency to make a lot of tools for things, and then it's just they're there, and people may or may not use them. So it's a little bit hard to know which tool should be used for which kind of problem. You just have to play with it. Anyways, yeah, that's good. Thank you, Kavya. It was yeah. They incorporated JAX. So yeah, this is the July 2026 newsletter. I just saw this in my inbox too. And then this is their.
Yeah, it's got links to the textbook resources. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I've seen that on YouTube as well. They've been pretty active this summer.
Those are links I should add. Yeah.
So yeah, there's if you're interested in seeing what's going on at the Active Inference Institute, you should check out this link. All right, Morgan, did you have some quick updates or?
Yes. Well, right now the big thing is the CompuCell 3D. I forget what he calls it. Workshop, summer school.
Yeah.
But this is the annual week that James Glazier and team go through. The It's like a short course of I think of it as kind of like a short course of his year-long courses, or his actual semester courses, because he does both like fully online YouTube videoed. But That's always good, and he also gets some great speakers. I think they just did the uh, like open VT for like virtual tissue meeting, and yeah, I'll try and find some. I'll try and find some resources. I mean, in terms of what was covered there, kind of what was done there. Um, yeah, still a really unique, or still uh, kind of like the only group in town certainly doing this as comprehensively. I feel um, as some, although I was I just yeah. Anyway, it's like I see a couple groups that do similar kind of depth on kind of like single cell biophysics. But again, like this kind of emphasis on multicellular still seems pretty unique. Um, yeah, so that's certainly the big outside. Well, the other big thing right now is the conference that everybody's in New York for is the neuromodulation NYC, and so this is like it's certainly a big um, transcranial. Well, transcranial of all physics forms, certainly electromagnetic. Um, um, People hooking batteries up to your head. Um, people people having figure eight coils with current flowing through to induce magnetic fields. um, all sorts of good neuromod work, and then following that is actually the next week is computational cognitive neuroscience, because and I know that one of the kind of main MedArt guy, Paul Scotty, is going to be presenting their Cortex MAE um, model at yeah DCN. Um, so those are kind of like the big conferences things. I was hoping yesterday to meet Gene Rintoul, who'd be back in the Bay Area, and to tell me about FUN, which is focused ultrasound neuromodulation. But it was in Paris, so I'm assuming it was also fun, although probably hot.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it is conference season, or this is the time where people use use grant money to travel to nice parts of the world, and uh, yeah, and hopefully I'll be able to find more videos of talks and things. And then, well, yeah, and then just I've definitely been doing a lot of uh, finishing up, trying to get ready for the San Francisco CogSci reading group that will be next, that is coming up this next week, or is it next week or the week after? Uh, but as you can see in my repos, yeah, I've just been replicating a number of these mechanistic interpretation papers that are also very tied into um, how you train reasoning models, LLM reasoning models. And so certainly the spinning up mech and terp resources are definitely getting fleshed out as I find more open resources for training, full reasoning models, done in an open science way, so you can really learn how these are put together, as well as like the when somebody comes out with a paper like Anthropic that wants to make some sort of leap um, to consciousness. um, you can have a better sense of like what kind of math they're trying to stretch into that shape. um the yeah Nathan Lampert is the researcher that I most recently found, that you'll see his videos. He's at, again, the Allen AI Institute, that has been really, so one, he's got an open source book, um, reinforcement learning, human feedback, and which is really documenting his experience training Olmo. um, and again, like this extra stage of training that is now the norm, where you've and how it works, you know and so it's great. He's got full YouTube series, as well as like he's got, like, just recently he was um interviewing somebody else that used to work there, talking about their experience, talking about papers, like it was also interesting just hearing them talking about working on this, seeing papers from other labs, kind of like in real time, and kind of like responding, like learning from this continual stream of research papers to, see what was good, see what they thought was, crazy, given their own experience doing this, and working at this scale. Again, like, super interesting, and yeah, and I think, just to say that in doing this, it's like I've gotten to the point where I think it would be interesting to start engaging with some of the AI safety people. Um, but um, but I think, like, it in even stronger form at this point, I see um, the real linguistic dangers that you get into trying to ask a model questions about the model's interior experience. And it's like, if you thought psychiatrists have a problem, I think some of the AI safety people, the way in which they approach the same problem, um, is yeah, needs a good 100 years of experience to you know make it a bit more solid, to kind of catch up with psychiatry. Um, oh, just um, these are just my um, most recent agentic coding is focused on training reasoning models. Jess.
Okay. Um, I agree. I agree with what you're saying, and I agree with the sort of the psychiatry stuff, but also like I feel like I wish I kind of was heard it like 5 minutes ago or whatever, but I think I want to agree with you, but I don't know that I'm just generally agreeing or like specific things, because I've been having so many conversations lately about differentiating model and um, you can say anthropomorphization of it, but just like what there's sort of this really understanding some of the technical of what is the thing doing versus all of this like
Yes.
I continued where in a short version, and I'm happy to we can go into this later or critique this because I don't think what I'm saying is sort of a sort of a gospel or a whatever, but like I I'm just surprised. I guess I'll put it this way: I'm surprised at how much I really just want there to be new terms and taxonomies for what is happening because I'm really tired. I'm getting increasingly tired, and I'm getting frustrated. And I always talk about language models, artifacts. Anyways, that's a me thing. Okay, it's a personal problem, if you will. But I'm getting increasingly, in a visceral sense, combative. I'm not actually being combative, but in a visceral sense, I'm like, I really wanna challenge certain people and ideas. This is not a commentary on what you or anybody said here. This is my own baggage right now. It's happened to be on my mind this morning. But I'm really increasing, like, in a constructive sense, I'm learning how to tease apart arguments and try to get at the core of this. In a less constructive sense, like, I feel very combative sometimes about, like, people need to it we have an inadequacy of of the language model's artifacts at hand to describe what's going on in some cases, or at least in terms of differentiating, here's the human equivalent of what we want. Here's what makes sense. Here's what this layer of agentic preparation has facilitated by making it more human-like and all that stuff. But it's like I continue to want there to be um, I'll come back to this later, and I'm gonna resist. I've been in such a I've had wonderful conversations already this morning, and I'm fine. I'm primed to do a lot of ranting. So I'm gonna say I am impressed or surprised at after this whole year of doing a lot of things and some of the works other interns are doing and everything else. I'm surprised at how much I've become even more in the mind that there's just so much like you said, like, go back to what you said, 100 more years of research about stuff. It's like, yeah, like, and not and this sort of intellectual dishonesty or ingenuousness or something along where it's like proceeding forth, like, the term like, the lack of caution about applying certain terms to trying to understand what's happening or creating these likenesses of things is, like, very it just has riled me up much more than I expected outside of today,
Yeah.
so I'll leave
Yeah.
it there.
It's and what this is coming off the back of for myself is really, about kind of like three papers from kind
Mm,
of frontier labs, if you will, that make strong cognitive science claims, you know,
mm,
and that my part of this is to prepare for a reading group around these. Part of it is that these papers came with no code and no data. So it's like all you could have is an armchair and being sick of having armchair discussions
mhm,
about computational projects. It's just like I have no idea how the field is I mean, again, it's because so many of these groups actually work for companies and aren't academics
mhm.
that the field has become so accepting of letting people not write papers, write preprints, and not, you
Yes.
know, preprints about computational projects that don't include code and data, which is the most crazy thing. And so I'm coming off of a kind of a spring of AI meetings that are about, like these aren't AI like when I was a student. This is AI where these are all computational objects that we now have and can play with. And yet we're going into AI meetings where we don't have the code and data. And so we end up armchairing this, like doing armchair discussions about the topics, which I
Yeah.
just think is insane. And then I go in and I look at these papers and I'm like, with agentic tools say, like, okay, how hard would it be to actually generate the code and data for these projects, leaving aside that I can't, get access to Anthropic or something like that. And
No,
then
this is,
the AI Institute's, the Allen AI Institute's work has been really helpful in this, where it's just like, oh, wait, you mean you can actually get access to this work? It doesn't have to be an armchair discussion. You can actually have the objects in place. And most of these papers don't hold up at all. In terms of like, I mean, honestly, Anthropic's paper has held up the best in terms of at least computationally replicating its particular work. The damage in the Anthropic paper is more one of language than it is of at least computational replicability. Um, but it's also this sense that like the some of the other papers, like there's a real lack of controls and real lack of worrying about the confounds, as opposed to jumping forward with much more kind of
yeah.
emotional emotional claims of deception, consciousness, and um, interesting emotional dialogue, right?
It's a bit
Where
like
it's
that.
just like, it's
Okay.
like, did you guys control for simple things like sentence length and things like that, where it's kind of funny. Yeah, anyway, that was my rant.
No, and that's well well said.
Well, yeah, I mean that's great. It's interesting discussion about replication, and well, I'm sure that some of that is because the people who put the preprints out are working on proprietary things. Also, that maybe they don't have it, in a environment where people can access the models directly, and some of that is proprietary, and some of that is because because you're having to use the computational resources that they had at their disposal in their organizations. Um, but yeah, I mean, it would be nice to be able to replicate these things, especially when you start making claims about the cognitive science aspects of it. I mean, it'd be nice to be able to demonstrate these in like a smaller toy model, say, where you could say, okay, well, we think the model is doing this, so we could set up an environment where it does this, and then demonstrate something. Because oftentimes, even with experiments in animals, we don't actually, we don't do the naturalistic version of it. We do like some sort of, contrived version in an experiment. We say, oh yeah, this is representative of this thing that's going on in the brain or in the mind. And then, of course, the replication part where, you don't have the code or things like that. But that's a problem, I think, more generally in science, where people don't, I mean, traditionally haven't provided the code. And so that's always been a thing. And there's been this whole argument about, well, we've had this discussion in meetings before about replication, where you publish a paper and then people can't replicate it. Sometimes that's the fault of the methods that they use, lack of controls or, lack of rigor. But sometimes it's also just because some things don't replicate. So it's a great discussion. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if, okay, I guess we'll come back to that later.
Well, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I happy to talk on this subject more. When it's the right time.
Yeah.
Um, the Yeah, yeah. and you know, I've been impressed with, you know, these open science groups that like like MedArc and like Cohere being one of the kind of like more LLM focused science labs. Um, and I feel like, you know, I do feel like there's a real opportunity here for this kind of, you know, this particular kind of computational cognitive science, you know, around these, you know, or I don't know what to call it, you know. It's like again, like I think cognitive science is the wrong thing because, you know, it's an artifact made from training on our language.
Right.
But well, and again, with reasoning models, it's trained on our language as the next token prediction. Then it's supervised, fine tuned, and that, you know, which is like again off of um, you know, kind of like chosen sentences, and then it's reinforcement trained, you know, uh, potentially again with human feedback, right?
Right.
Other models, you know, it's like, so you know, like it's not just, I mean, that's what I'm trying to get at in terms of like consciousness research is, you know, when Anthropic's making this claim about consciousness, it's like you're not really talking about the next token prediction stuff. You're really talking about the RL, the RLHF part, right? And you know, so it's trained on all of our texts, but it's also kind of trained on our behaviors, right? So
Yeah.
you know, but at the same time, like I think it's probably a misnomer to call it, you know, computational cognitive science. like
Yeah.
yeah, it's artificial behavior or something, yeah. But that is the other thing that I think is like very Emily Bender, which is that like our entire, you know, our language is not ready for this. And
Right.
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And that's why like I'm thinking, I'm reminded of the grad student in Patty May's Fluid Interfaces MIT Media Lab space, because I was talking like in one of the seminars that the AHA group runs. I was raising questions sort of along these lines, and Patty mentioned the student, and their thesis or whatever is about uh, behavioral science for machines, basically. And it was like, yeah, like I'm very like I really want to go back to my point, and we can move on to other things. Is that I really think like we just to try to be concise and pithy. All the stuff Morgan said is applicable to the sort of requirement to build out the language itself. This is not pithy at all. I'm sorry, but like the direction a lot of things are going in is almost like it feels diametrically opposed at times to like instead of racing forward using like kind of crappy terminology, like makeshift cob jobs of like, well, I'm gonna use this term to explain this thing, and that's cool, and like that also opens the door for like fun, hype, big stuff as well. Is like diametrically opposed to I call it theory work of developing the language, like the philosophy, the language, and the structure of what you're trying to do relative to what exists. You can't just keep laying down the same tile over and over and over again and expecting a different outcome. It's like you gotta make a different tool for the purpose. So I will close on that.
Okay, well, sorry. Now I have to jump into just one last thing. It's just like the other thing that got me going is seeing a Sam Harris video talking to an AI alignment guy, and and Sam Harris just couldn't stop talking about like his, I don't know if it's his partner or his like collaborator, but just like having these discussions with Claude and about like meditation or something like it reminded me of who's the guy, um um was it like Roger Penrose or someone recently who talked about their conversations with Claude. um it wasn't Roger Penrose.
It's Richard Dawkins,
um
maybe.
Dawkins,
Yeah,
Dawkins. Thank you, thank you.
yeah.
Yes, yes, yeah. It was like the worst kind of anecdotal, the worst kind of anecdotal discussion, and yet like I came away feeling like that I was talking to a person. I was like, what? like, why are you sharing this with us? we can do better. We can do better. Yeah.
Like, can you go back to like 1966 and talk to Eliza and feel the same thing too? Like, anyway.
Exactly, right? I mean, I'd prefer, yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. So I mean, but that goes back to my point about like we need to, if we want to explore some of these things, we maybe need to build a model, like a toy model, to like demonstrate what we're actually getting at. Because it's not just the language; it's sort of the concepts. We have a concept
Yeah.
of cognition that is rooted in human cognition, and we can compare it. We can compare whatever a machine is doing to that, but there are things conceptually. It's probably there are distinctions that a lot of these groups don't get into because they're interested in like doing the preprint, and then I don't know. So they kind of drift away from the actual cognitive science of it, but they make a cognitive science claim, which is kind of weird. I mean, like the business of a lot of the AI groups is to write a technical paper, and they kind of use that to kind of advance these kind of claims, and it's like, well, that's inadequate. You need to kind of work on validating or invalidating the claims, and that requires pure research in cognitive science using different tools that kind of get rid of a lot of the confounds or get rid of a lot of the ambiguities.
Yeah.
Looks like Jesse is getting a
why I'm pulling this up again in support of your point is like I feel like the rigor of the work that Bradley described and that Morgan's sort of pointing to, and I'm awkwardly flailing my arms at, is so there are people doing it. It's sort of like actual advancement will come through doing that. and so I'm bringing up the infamous behavior purpose teleology paper and saying, like, this is sort of a line in time of 1943, but there's been certain developments in a particular path of what that has been, and it's sort of like there's not really a lot of and this is what I think like Michael Levin is trying to do in a lot of ways is circling back around and being like, okay, or like there's a paper of sorts. I guess a manuscript is a better way to say it that I'm writing, and I think I mentioned it here before, but it's like cognitive science 1.0 went in a very particular direction about what it bracketed or didn't bracket in terms of methods and analogies and what it's trying to do, and this is what it is. And it's like, okay, given this, let's hold for this and do this specific thing and go in this direction. And it's like there's not really this for lack of better, respect for those choices and saying, well, we have to keep building. We'll keep in my tile analogy. We'll keep using these same tiles and stack them, and throw AI and technology at it. It's like there's a certain there's a certain inadequacy to it. And then as taking that down into the more, for lack of better words, concrete things that Bradley just said. doing that work in the context of the broader project of the last 80 years is important. So we're coming up with the part of what we're dealing with is sort of an immense lack of poverty and excess in sort of this technological stuff, and then there's still these other things that are kind of, I don't want to say constraints, but there's limits in other cases that will need to be contended with because the other stuff just won't hold and so on. Anyway, I will cease for the time being.
Poverty of the conceptual stimulus, I guess. Yeah, that's because we do have all these tools, but we don't know exactly, and we're making claims that we can't substantiate. So, I mean, it's like,
and just because we're in a moment now where you can make like this is the year. This like I know I'm being recency biased for someone, but like I can't think of a time 2025 or 2026 if you're going to make money or just make unsubstantiated claims along certain things. This is the time to do it. Like we are in a golden era of making unsubstantiated claims, and maybe that's not actually true, but it certainly feels like it. Like it really feels like, and so it's like a lot of the work that I'm doing in certain things is I fuss about it and I talk about it, and then I sort of be like, this is sort of what's happening. There are things you can do that are not that are harder and less glorious or less visible in the way that it is visible right now. But like, if you want to do those things and you want to roll up your sleeves and do it, like you can. And I think that's important for people to know too. So it's not just complaining. It's like they're like, I'm going to look at Morgan's repo again and look at that stuff, but all the stuff we're talking about here, and the work is there. It's hard to do, but it's there. So, okay,
Yeah.
let's move on to another subject because I feel like I'm kind of holding the train up from moving on.
Oh yeah, no, that's fine. That's good conversation to have. All right, so we'll let's see. Next thing I want to talk about is that we haven't met in 2 weeks. So in that 2 weeks, we've had several meetings, and I'm going to go through those. We did not have an open source meeting this week, and in the previous week, we did not have a DevaWorm meeting. So I'm going to kind of jumble together these meetings across the last 2 weeks. The week before this last week, I did not have a DevaWorm meeting, but instead, I put out this video on Richard Gordon, who was one of our collaborators in DevaWorm. And this is a memoriam to his work and our collaboration specifically. So I covered a lot of the stuff that he had on his Google Scholar, and talked about some of the areas that he was interested in. So he's done a lot of work in different areas. There are 5 main areas where he did work in, and then of course that work, he did papers that kind of cross those boundaries. I mean, in general, he was a very interdisciplinary scientist, where he would think about questions, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then frame some work around that. And so we have at least 5 areas that he was interested in: early life, diatoms and nanotechnology, computational biology and modeling, cancer physics, which he focused on sort of at the end of his life, and then embryogenesis, which is what DevaWorm was all about. So we had usually, his embryogenesis work was front and center for us, but then we focused on some of these other areas. So computational biology as well, but then we focused on some of these other areas as it became relevant. So that was actually part of DevaWorm as well, and that his influence shaped some of the research questions we tackled. And so I met Richard Gordon, or Dick as he was called usually, in this embryo physics course that him and his wife Natalie put on in Second Life. So this is the Silver Bog area, and we would we would get our avatars ready. We'd sit down in some virtual chair and then watch presentations. And this was on all aspects of embryo physics. So this was on physics and embryogenesis and kind of the intersection of those two areas. I had a couple of presentations here, and then we had this collaboration online. We finally met in person when I was at Michigan State. He came to visit, and he visited our department and gave this talk, Cause and Effect in the Interaction Between Embryogenesis and the Genome. He also visited me when I moved to Champaign-Urbana and gave a talk on embryogenesis there. Then we started DevoWorm. So this was our first meeting, April 11th, 2014. And we got together with Stephen Larson, who was the one of the people at the time who was spearheading a lot of the OpenWorm collaborations. And we started DevoWorm. And it was actually in response to a GitHub issue. But it quickly evolved away from that issue, and it is what it is today. And I have a video on the DevoWorm YouTube channel on 10 years of DevoWorm, which I published, I think, 2 years ago. So you'll have to check that out to see the sort of the history of DevoWorm. Then he had this, he wrote this book in 1999, and he had this idea about differentiation trees, differentiation waves, and some other differentiation-related concepts that, really were theoretical beyond a lot of what we could actually measure and characterize, at least in 1999. And so this was sort of his white whale, and I use the Moby Dick joke because, it's this idea that you pursue this idea your entire life, and you have mixed results in reaching that goal. So this was his white whale, differentiation trees and waves, and kind of finding those in embryos and validating that larger theoretical concept. It's a little bit like what we're talking about with large language models, in that there's a lot of stuff that's there, but it's like the trick is like validating it and figuring out how to refine those claims and getting your hand around the phenomenon, instead of just kind of making claims and then, kind of not showing your work so much. And, which is fine, except that it's not the same as actually nailing down the claims. So he wrote this, and it's really a thick book. And there's a lot of stuff in this book that, should be followed up on, I think. But it's like when you, sometimes you're in a situation where you have a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of kind of work that you want to follow up on. And you propose like a theory, and then it's up to other people to kind of find their way through and validate some of that. So that's what this book was. And I can, this book is available. I can, give people copies of this book if you need it. But basically, he focused on this idea of differentiation waves. And so we did a number of different pieces of work on this in the group. These are just examples of different waves in development. There's, of course, the I-furrow and Drosophila, which we explored in a paper. There's Xenopus embryonic waves, which are in the Xenopus model organism, where there are these different stages of development, and you have these waves that are coordinating the anatomy. And then, of course, you have calcium waves that are activated in early embryogenesis. So you can actually take those waves as instances of differentiation waves. And we did that in a paper in 2024 that we published looking at differentiation waves and in different model organisms. And then this is an example of how he thought of differentiation waves across, like systems that are metamorphic. So this is like a caterpillar, the tree for a caterpillar here, and then the caterpillar goes into a cocoon, and then it de-differentiates and redifferentiates as a butterfly here. Or sometimes you can take these differentiation trees and you can look at them across evolutionary time by looking at populations of differentiation trees and how they change. So this is all stuff that, kind of he drew conceptual images of, and it's like not something that is rigorous science, but you could explore that in, later work. We did differentiation trees for mosaic development in C. elegans. I think that was one of his goals in DevoWorm, and we did some papers in 2016 on that, where we looked at the mosaic differentiation tree in C. elegans and in the sea slug Siona intestinalis. And then this is a visualization of that differentiation tree. It's basically reorganizing the lineage tree in a certain way. Then we looked at differentiation waves in the imaginal disk of Drosophila. We operated from this very high resolution drawing, so we were able to segment this image and build a model of the differentiating disk, and then make statements about waves or wave activity. And so we did this. Published a paper on this in 2018. And you can see, obviously, it'd be better if we had like dynamic drawings or drawings at different stages of this. But this process is pretty regular, so we could make statements about, say, like this undifferentiated group of cells versus this furrow or this front line versus things going on behind it, which was the formation of ommatidia, or the eye, the little eye components that you get in an insect eye. And so, we can make statements about different types of differentiation waves. There are actually two types of differentiation waves. There's an expansion wave and a contraction wave. And so he had different hypotheses about this, where, you have different mechanisms in the cell that lead to differentiation, but then also this communication with other cells and coordinating that communication so that groups of cells differentiate together. So this was our computational, theoretical computational biology work. This is an example from that 2024 paper where we then attached gene expression to this anatomical model, and we made some statements across model organisms. Then he had his work on diatoms, and so he published a number of books on diatoms and invited people to contribute. We did some work on the rod-shaped gliding diatom Basilaria spa, which is like this this diatom that lives in a colony, and the cells move against one another like an accordion, and that's how they move through the water column. So we analyzed some of that movement and did some dynamical systems analysis of that, and made some statements about their locomotion from that. Then, of course, he had the early life work. We did this paper on the ensemble approach to the origin of life. I'm going to present on that in the next few months, kind of following up on what we published in this paper. But basically, it's this idea of ensembles and their role in enabling the emergence of life. An ensemble being sort of the statistical physics tool of ensembling, meaning of a population of things, and that diversity then leads to some outcome. And then, so this, we explored in this paper, we explored this idea of evolvability, or the origins of evolvability, and the origins of compartmentalization. So those two things contributing to early life. Then he liked to ask a lot of open questions. So open questions for Dick was sort of the grist of the exploratory or the academic process. And so, always if you ask good questions, maybe that's sort of the basis of science. It isn't really like rigor. Rigor is what we do to kind of solve the problem, but if you don't have a good question, no amount of rigor in the world is going to help you out of that problem. So he liked to ask these open questions, and we would have sessions in DevoWorm where ask questions, and then people would follow up and refine those questions, and then you could apply the methods to those questions. So, some of the questions were pretty obscure, and some of them were pretty open, but we've managed to we take some of these questions and refine them down to a good set of studies. He had all sorts of open questions he was interested in, and that sort of led to a lot of the different areas that he was interested in. So he'd ask a question about one thing, and it would lead him in a different direction, and that would be sort of the interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary linkage. So this is, kind of moving into his work on cancer physics, which kind of came from his interest in imaging. So, he was interested in imaging embryos, and then the interest in imaging was then led to this cancer physics idea. So, it was basically the idea that you could have cheap and high power imaging, and that deploying that would allow us to end certain types of cancers, or at least improve the ability to diagnose cancers and to fight cancers. And so, and then this slide talks about a paper that Dick, myself, and Hussein Ather wrote on using Perlin noise as a masking tool for tumors. So that was an open question that he posed in a DevoWorm meeting, and then I worked on some demos for it, and we worked it out, and then finally we got to the point where we asked another question, which was, can you use Perlin noise not just to mask tumors, and then to use Perlin noise as an analog for the noise that tissues create in that process, but could you actually model tissues with Perlin noise? And that's something actually I'm working on now, and I presented on this a couple weeks ago in DevoWorm, so it's actually somewhat promising. So I'll come back to that later, but that's just an example of how you ask questions, and then that leads you to different places, and then that defines you and your work. And of course, he was a great mentor, and we actually exchanged mentees. We exchanged a number of people between us. Like, some people would start off with me and move in the direction of what Dick was doing. Other times it was the reverse, and sometimes, a lot of times though, people were going back and forth. And mentorship is about, I guess, just helping people think about things, and talking with them about different things that they're interested in, and then listening to what they're talking about. And this was always, I think, a strength of his, guiding people in certain directions, using your wealth of knowledge to push things in one direction or another. So that's he was a great mentor. He had hundreds of mentees, and we actually talked about sort of scientific legacy, and talked about what happens when you die, what happens to your work, what happens to your ideas, and that's a question. I don't know. I mean, we didn't have an answer for it, but it's worth thinking about. And definitely, it's not something people kind of tend to be forgotten after they die, unless they've won the Nobel Prize or something. So it's sad, but I think probably though this is the kind of thing that you could also do in a research group, is to follow up on people's ideas, and revisit their work. That's certainly what we do with cybernetics work, and so that's a conversation for another time. So finally, Hussein Ather prepared this LinkedIn tribute to Dick, and Jesse, of course, commented on this, and it just it was a nice little tribute. So that was that talk, and that's on the DevoWorm YouTube channel. So this is the DevoWorm meeting for the 27th of July, and so this is the following week, where we I did it a little bit differently in terms of production. Ashby did some pull requests in the DevoGraph repository, so I went over that. Then I talked about this talk that I just showed. We talked about this paper, Ultrac, pushing the limits of cell tracking across biological scales. And I went through this paper and its figures. A lot of interesting stuff in this paper. This was something I think Morgan talked about in terms of, the groups that were doing this work, and how they have their resources open to the larger community. It's basically this, we do a lot of cell tracking work in DevoWorm, and they provide a pipeline for computationally scaling this up, but for the average researcher, not just for like the big labs. So they provide these tools for this. They have this figure in the paper where they talk about how much computational time it takes to do the type of cell tracking in different model organisms. So in C. elegans and Drosophila and in zebrafish, and using different types of hardware to do it. So yeah, we talked about this paper quite a bit and went over it. And then then Morgan brought up that this was something that was done in concert with the Chan Zuckerberg BioHub, and and the cell tracking challenge, which is a source of a lot of the data that we've used in Google Summer of Code and DevoWorm, but also is a good resource if you're interested in any kind of cell tracking data set to benchmark your own algorithms, or to get, to develop your own kinds of approaches to this. So the second paper that we talked about is this paper, Determinants of the Transition Zone Width of Morphogen Readouts. This is a paper that talks about how to model Turing morphogenesis or reaction to fusion morphogenesis, and they give this mathematical model. Then they show examples of their model in terms of how it's able to produce patterns, gradual changes from one type of cell to another, and then showing how you can tune that with the different parts of their mathematical model. Okay, then last week, not this last Friday, but the Friday before, we had our open source meeting for the 24th of July. And so this is where Ashby again was there talking about her work on on DevoGraph. Barshan was also there talking about his work on DevoGraph. So we had some conversations there. Then I got into this feature about the new frontier of open source licensing. So we've been going in this direction for a couple weeks, where we've talked about different open source challenges, some of them having to do with agentic coding, but more generally it's about licensing, because when you use agentic coding or do agentic coding in open source, it opens up a lot of questions about licensing, about the terms of licensing, and how you're using training sets, how you're contributing to organizations, and how sustainable all of that is. So licensing is an important part of this because it kind of lays down the terms of use or the terms of engagement for open source organizations. For example, some organizations don't have the resources to take in a very large number of pull requests generated by agents or people using agents because their maintainers have to go through and quality control a lot of the code. And people's workflows when they do agentic coding may or may not include quality checks or other, their methods are different. And so it doesn't ensure the kind of, open source projects have always had a problem with sort of standardization and quality control, and that people, write code and maybe they have different techniques for writing code. They have different standards for quality. They have different standards for adhering to the issue that's at hand. So that's nothing new. What's new here is the volume. And so if you generate a lot of code in that way, versus maybe preparing different patches and things like that. It creates a problem in the organization. And quite frankly, there are other problems with compensation that are also kind of gone unsolved. And so open source licensing is sort of the confluence of a lot of these changes, plus a lot of the outstanding problems in open source. So we talked about open source licensing and sort of the advances there. There's been some interesting advances in licensing, and it's kind of been forced by a lot of these newer developments. Now, this is an article we read on this Open Software License 3.0, and their emphasis is on sort of compensating contributors and ensuring that there's accountability and transparency in the contributions and in the different models that are produced under the license, and also having a community of sort of discussion. So where does that exist? Where does that live? And then how does that fit into the project? So they actually, for this license, they draw from the Free Software Foundation's work on, and this goes back to the 1980s, on thinking about how software should be free in terms of access and free in terms of sort of the barrier to entry, meaning that we don't want to make the barrier to entry so high that people can't contribute. But we also want to have the things that I just talked about, like quality checks and accountability. And so then this is all part of this licensing scheme or this governance scheme that is the sort of thing that we had a discussion about. And then we talked about open weight versus open source AI models. Open weight models being less open than open source models. Open source models being where you give people the source code for your models. Open weight is just where you give them the weights, and then that's sort of the accountability mechanism. And so there are differences between these two types of approaches, and why we need to kind of understand that so that we can know what we're getting when we talk about open AI models. Like OpenAI. Is OpenAI open? Well, I mean, that depends on your perspective. And so this just talks about a lot of these different aspects of this distinction. We had a discussion about that. And then I think that discussion was, pretty much the whole meeting. Actually, Morgan talked about the OMO 3 model in the meeting too. So this is the OMO 3 model, which is, of course, the model that he mentioned earlier in this meeting. This is, and then talking about mechanistic interpretation and repo that we showed earlier in our meeting here. And then we talked a little bit about this resource on this is mechanistic interpretation, an example of it, on transformer interpretability. I think this was a book on mechanistic interpretation. And then that was our meeting. The final thing I wanted to talk about was our Cognition Futures meeting from this last week. So we didn't have one the previous week, but we did have one this week on Wednesday. And so there's Jesse and me. We're kind of getting ready for the meeting, and we got into our reading. So we took a paper and we talked about it. We actually were looking for the paper for next time. So that's what this is. So yeah. So this is the special issue that we've been drawing from for the last several meetings. The Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. And our paper, so the previous Cognition Futures meeting, we talked about the I in AI, which was the identity of the model. And we talked about, it was Douglas Hofstadter, and he talked about strange loops and all of that. This is another one where it's kind of talking about the self in the model. So like the self is the model's awareness of itself, or again, the language barrier is there. Maybe it's not self-awareness, maybe it's just self-modeling or they talked about self-regularization in this paper. So that means that there's something that the model is doing to itself to reinforce its own kind of self-reference, maybe. Recursion, of course, is a very popular theme of Douglas Hofstadter, and it's something that we do all the time in computer science. But somehow we're using recursion to build this self model. So they go through the paper, and this is a key piece here. We propose that networks that learn to self-model are not only better at predictively modeling themselves, but are also trained in such a way that they should be better at being predictively modeled by other agents. So it's sort of a theory of mind thing here, where there's the self-regularization of the model that makes the models more amenable to other models, and then you can have this sort of society of models. And so this is a little bit more about the paper. We had this discussion about self-regularization and what it means. I pulled up some things on, what the model was trying to get at. We'll have to get back to that because I diagrammed it out and built a little 3 or 4 slide show about this. So, but I'm not going to talk about it now. We'll talk about it later. And this is just kind of talking about the consequences, largely positive, about self-regularization. It's basically dealing with error, prediction error, and lessening that prediction error, and making yourself more legible to other agents and to humans. So that's what it's all about. And they move between this idea of Michael Graziano is one of the authors on this paper. He does a lot of stuff with consciousness. And so that's kind of where they're going with this sort of the theory of mind consciousness realm. So the language kind of floats between like agents and, well, between biological agents and artificial agents. In fact, the whole special issue does this, where there's not a huge distinction made between the biological and the artificial agents. Now, is that a problem? Well, I mean, probably not, because we're talking about an agent, right? A computational agent. And so if you accept the premise that biological systems are computational agents or have some form of computational agency that's comparable to the biological context, or biological context being comparable to the artificial context, then it doesn't necessarily matter, although it's very vague in terms of what the mechanisms are. But I think one thing this special issue could have used is a paper that explicitly addressed that distinction. And what is our state of knowledge there? In other words, what is our state of knowledge of artificial agent, let's say agency, but being an artificial computational agent versus being a biological computational agent? What are the differences, if any, and how generic is this sort of model that we have of computational agency? Because we've talked about this before, that sometimes we make these blanket statements about a concept and we apply it to everything, and there are distinctions even between humans or between animals or between artificial agent types. And and then not to mention that there's this gulf between the artificial and the biological. I guess the implication is that there's no specific architecture; it's architecture agnostic. But if that's true, then that means that you could have anything be a computational agent. You could have plants, you could have inanimate objects, etc. So there's a lot of work to be done here, and it's really, I guess there's a lot of future work to be done with this special issue as well. And I have proposed a session at the Active Inference Institute symposium on this special issue. So we have some work ahead of us in preparing for that. And so, yeah, this is definitely a nice paper. Amanda had some comments here about some of the things going on in this paper, and we did cover some of the things about what it means to be self-regularized. This is an area, of course, of active research in statistical learning, but of course, linking that to what we're talking about in this paper, it's somewhat of a leap. It's drawing from this work, but again, you're taking inspiration from this work, and unless you spell out a very specific model of statistical learning, then it's a little bit different. And there are differences that we need to account for. So this is kind of going through, and again, they're talking about social disabilities such as autism spectrum disorder, trauma-related social difficulties, and schizophrenia that may be partially related to incomplete self-models. This is a theme that came up, I think, in our last meeting as well, where Avery was talking about how if you're drunk, you kind of have an incomplete model of reality. Your mind is kind of disconnected a little bit, and you can compare like a drunken rant with like a large language model hallucination. I don't want to misrepresent Avery on that, but like basically that's the idea. And so this just brings again to mind this idea of, what exactly are the distinctions between artificial and biological computational agentic models? Yeah, so then, we finished up the meeting, I think, and then next time I think we're going to talk about, or a paper from a different special issue, the dynamicist landscape, I think is what we landed on. All right, so that I think is a good overview of that work, or the meetings that we had. Any questions or comments about that?
Yeah, I mean, again, this gets. Sorry that I've been unable to attend. It's I feel bad. It's just Wednesday at 9 is a particularly overbooked time. um, and at least one of those was the complexity reading group, which is also a really interesting discussion group and paper coverage. But in particular, I'm sorry because this is like a really interesting topic, or is kind of where this mechanistic interpretability ends and kind of like AI safety begins, is when you start trying to care about how the agent talks about itself, and the weird loops that you're getting into.
The strange loops, perhaps.
I don't want to call them strange loops because this is like I mean, I don't want to do any injustice to what Hofstadter was talking about, whereas I feel like these are maybe more circular loops.
Yeah.
not strange loops, but just straight loops. Like sometimes it's just a plain loop. And like we were talking about earlier, just how best to again, the big issue that has come out from kind of like reviewing these ostensibly frontier lab papers is like how poor the controls are for so much of this work. It seems like controls are just not, or like an afterthought, if anything. And again, it's like the one thing a researcher named Andrew Trask, who's the guy. So, Trask said something like, saw the Anthropic paper. It's like, God, I miss peer review or something like that. It's just, it's like, yeah, if you're always writing for peer review, then there is never any kind of control or anything like that. Anyway, but that would have been a really great paper. Sounds good. Yeah. Did you say you're gonna post you've got the video discussion on this?
Yeah. So which one is that? The cognition
The
features.
self. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I think
Or
that's actually
cybernetics
on
reading group or whatever you call it.
yeah, cognition futures. I think that's on the Joe
Okay.
Pro YouTube.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Cool.
So that's good. Yeah. So that's great. Okay. Kavya had a question here. I was curious about the agentic coding work you had mentioned last Saturday on Slack. Oh yeah. So that was well. I've been doing a couple things there. The first is, of course, following up on the Pro and noise tissue modeling stuff. So I've been working on that, doing some comparisons with like the Gray-Scott model of morphogenesis and the Turing morphogenesis reaction diffusion models. A lot of stuff that when I present it, I'll explain more about what that is. It's a work in progress. I think conceptually it's a work in progress, as well as like getting the right comparisons. And this is a problem again with the experimental conditions that you're setting up. Like, when you do agentic coding, you want to make sure that you have like, you approach it like you might approach an experiment, where you have like, you figure out what comparisons to make, and then you figure out what the pattern is not, or like, sometimes you have to go far afield and then come back. So you don't immediately say, well, if I build a Gray-Scott model of different types, or just build a simple Gray-Scott model, is that immediately relevant to my Pro and noise model? And it's like, well, not really, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to loop back and try to connect them together and see what kinds of parameters the agent is proposing for these different things, and then kind of draw a mapping between those. So like there are different ways that you can kind of explore what the model gives you something, and it might give you a nice little visualization, and you're like, okay, but what if I modeled this in a different way? Or what if I had like a bunch of candidate models and then I compared them in some way? It is a lot like we're kind of creating our own platform for this sort of exercise. Like a lot of times what we would do is we would try to maybe build some code for maybe like Pro and noise, or we try to simulate it in a program, like maybe a physics engine. And then we'd evaluate the output. And that's, there's still this interpretability problem as to what does my pattern mean? And this is a problem, I think, in computational research more generally, is that there's this lack of controls. Because in biology, you're always putting controls in the mix, and the reviewers are always requesting more controls. In fact, a lot of biology research is the opposite problem which you have with a lot of these large language model papers or AI papers, and that they have way too many controls, quite frankly. They try to rule everything out. And of course, it costs time and money to do that. But, really the purpose of a control is to say what something is not. It's like a counterfactual without actually building the causal model for a counterfactual. So you're kind of saying what something is not, or what the significance of a certain pattern is, or whatever. So that's kind of one of the things I was doing in agentic modeling. Was working on this problem with the Pro and noise, and comparing it with other morphogenesis models, and then building out that case for it, The other thing I was working on is this, it's an idea I've been working on for several years on circuitous connectomes, which is like, if you're familiar with the Brainberg vehicle, there's this sensor and effector pairing that you see in the Brainberg vehicles, and then there are these interneurons that sit between the sensor and effector. It's a wonderful model of very simple embodiment. What I've been doing is building these models, and I've been doing this for over 10 years, where you have intermediate nodes, intermediate interneurons, but you have a lot of them. And the mapping becomes very convoluted and complex. And so then the question I'm asking there is, like, if you build these networks out, or these chains out to a significant extent, like if you have 10 interneurons or 1,000 interneurons or 10,000 interneurons, what is the change in the behavior of the embodied agent? And so I've been running some simulations on that, where, again, running a simulation in a agent or a large language model is a little bit different from running a simulation from scratch. You really have to be mindful of how you structure the experiment and asking counterfactuals and getting some sense of what the model is doing instead of just taking it at face value. That's a problem that, and it's like, I've spent a lot of time on just saying, like, okay, you're giving me this output, but what is it? What do these different parameters mean? What does it mean to, have this relationship? And sometimes you find out that the model is making assumptions that, maybe are bad. I had one case where, like, it was modeling something in a certain way. It was giving, like, kind of a uniform output, and I wanted it to be variable because I knew that if you were to run this in, like, sort of a forward manner where you defined all the parameters, that it would be like the numbers would be different. So I had to go back and kind of figure out what the mechanism was using. Turns out that it was sort of making some assumptions that I wanted to correct. So it's not just like controls, it's also like kind of the internal structure of what the model is, how the model is generating the output. It's making certain assumptions about how things are related, and you have to maybe sometimes probe the model and correct it, or change some of those things just to see what the results will be. So a lot of stuff with experimentation and experimental methods, and trying to use better experimental methods for some of this stuff. So a lot of work I was doing on that, and I've just been working on this, like, off and on as I can, and it's kind of like been a rabbit hole thing where, you want to just see what you can do, and then you're kind of developing your own methods, and then eventually, we'll have some maybe more solid methods that we can draw from. Right? Did we have any other comments before I move on, or was that to your satisfaction, Kavya? I don't know. Yeah. It's good. Oh, well, I use a combination of tools. I'll use a lot of Copilot and the Gemini models, or Notebook LM, and then some open source models and things like that. So it really depends on what I'm doing. Or again, I wish I had a better, sort of more established tool chain. I guess over time, it depends on what I'm trying to do. I find some models better at certain things than others. So.
Yeah, yeah. Even I want to use some local LMs, but yeah, due to computational constraints, I can't.
Yeah, that's always the thing you run up against, is the if it's going to overload your buffer with, because you might have like something that and I notice this with large language models, they don't really do it immediately with respect to memory constraints. So it'll just give you some code, you try to run it, and it just, like, you keep running up against a memory limitation. So you have to go back and you have to figure out, how do I make this smaller? How can I run this? Because remember, you don't need to run like You don't need to run the full the full thing. Sometimes you just need a demonstration of it, and then see how you can improve your code from there. So it's not about like maybe simulating 10,000 iterations or making a huge display of this thing. It's just like a little model that you can draw inferences from and then kind of work your way up. And the memory limitation is always going to be there, because like a lot of times you're working on a problem that has like so many moving parts that it's really hard to run all of that in one shot. You really need to kind of figure out how to modularize your work. Okay, so yeah, that's good. We should have another conversation about that as well. I know we're queued up with our conversations about this stuff, but I have a lot of interesting papers in our queue here. This was one that I ran across. This was from the journal Kybernetes. So Kybernetes is another term, a way to say cybernetics. And it's a journal that is sort of like the philosophy and practice of cybernetics, not really like in any one field. It's just kind of like this. It's like a quasi-humanities journal, quasi-science journal. I mean, like you'll see a lot of really interesting papers in this journal. So this is from Richard Sean O'Rourke, who's an independent researcher. And the reason I bring this up is because, of course, we had our paper on the special issue that we talked about earlier in the meeting on the Evergood regulator theorem and its relevance to world models. This paper is arguing that the large language model is basically a variety transducer. So if you're familiar with Ashby's work, it did work on a lot of things. Of course, he did the Evergood regulator theorem, but he also talked a lot about variety and the role of variety in cybernetics and cybernetic regulation. And so that's and we talked about variety several weeks ago, more generally in cybernetics, as this concept of, what is your cybernetic model acting upon? It's acting upon variety. If there's no variety, you can't really regulate anything because there's nothing to regulate. If you have variety, then you can select from a number of options. You can regulate that. You have enough information to regulate the behavior. And so that gives you some way to tune your cybernetic model. So this is where the idea here is that the large language model is a variety transducer in the classic cybernetic sense. Ashby's intelligence-amplifier architecture, and Stafford Beer's viable systems model as a diagnostic and predictive framework. So Ashby's intelligence-amplifier is this idea where you can use some technology. It could be a large language model. It could be a prosthetic device. It could be a computer to augment human intelligence, or in the parlance of embodied cognition, as sort of an offloading device and sort of a thing that amplifies the measure of intelligence that you're using to characterize the natural intelligence or the human intelligence. So if you think about like a computer or a laptop, you use a laptop to write out ideas, to formalize them. You might have a notepad device that allows you to take notes and to recall them, and it improves your intelligence in that sense. This is a closed-loop feedback model, so you're always in consultation with your amplifier. Given that you get positive feedback from that amplifier, it improves your intelligence. If you get negative feedback or no feedback, then it doesn't. And so it's a closed-loop feedback model. Beer's viable systems model is something that Stafford Beer developed for organizations to look at, the complexity of organizations and how those mimic the human brain in their organization. So there's all this sensory input that you have in organizations. There are these effectors in organizations where they affect the world, and there's feedback between different levels of the organization. So it's a really interesting model But he's going to kind of bring these two together in talking about large language models. So the abstract here, this article argues that W. Ross Ashby's formal intelligence amplifier architecture, which he introduced in 1956, and Stafford Beer's viable systems model, which he introduced in 1984, taken together constitute a more precise and more diagnostically powerful account of large language model systems than the four framings currently dominant in AI discourse. Those four framings are as a knowledge base, as a reasoning engine, as a stochastic parrot, and as a foundation model. I'm not sure what he means by framing, but basically maybe a way to understand the model. They don't really think foundation model is kind of in competition with stochastic parrot or knowledge base. But the idea is that we have these four ways of looking at them, basically. And then this is kind of a fifth way. So then this method, the method that he proposes here, draws on the structure mapping approach by Gentner. Beer's variety transducer is used as a base to target large language models, whereas Ashby's formal specification for an intelligence amplifier is used as a base to target the common architecture within which the modern large language model is deployed. And then this is usually via chat interaction. So there's a chat interaction, there's a closed-loop feedback system, and it amplifies the user's intelligence. Beer's viable systems model was applied to identify the recursive structure that makes this coupled system viable. So you have this closed-loop feedback system between, say, the user and the large language model. Then he uses the viable systems model to sort of characterize that system and identify the recursive structure there and make sure that we are targeting the right kind of interactions that allow for augmentation or intelligence amplification. 3 case studies drawn from the paper's own production illustrate the framework's diagnostic vocabulary under explicit second-order reflexive acknowledgement. Then the findings are that the large language model realizes Beer's variety transducer abstraction. The intelligence amplifier in Ashby's sense is not a property of the large language model alone, but of the coupled system comprising model, human, and problem environment. The human provides all metasystemic functions. This is the viable systems model 3, 3-star, 4, and 5. So a word on this is to recognize that the viable systems model is a really complex model. There are these different levels that are kind of like from the individual to the collective to the organization to the world. And they mimic sort of the nervous system and its sort of hierarchical organization of stimuli. How you go from like the sensory input to process stimulus to multimodal interactions to like basically something like consciousness or coherent percepts or things like, or coherent cognition or things like that. And so this is kind of thinking about the human as sort of the reasoning or the sort of supervision that the large language model cannot supply. So kind of thinking about it, this closed loop feedback not only in terms of the intelligence amplifier model, but also then thinking about the relationship between humans and large language models as the viable system. So the higher levels of the viable system are the human, the lower levels are the model. So that's what he's getting at here. Autonomous agent failure is diagnosed as the structural absence of these functions from the recursion. So he kind of talks about where this mapping breaks down. Okay, so then the originality and value proposition, mapping Ashby's intelligence amplifier specification onto a common large language model architecture and applying Beer's viable systems model to the viability required for convergence of the human large language model system. So we have this intelligence amplifier that specifies this relationship between how a user might use a large language model architecture. It doesn't matter what the architecture of the large language model is. It's just that capturing that interaction. And then Beer's viable systems model is required to look at the convergence of these two systems and how they're processing information. The framework generates testable predictions about hallucination, prompt sensitivity, session variability, and autonomous agent failure. Yeah, so that's the abstract. And then we have the introduction here. Cybernetics treats not things, but ways of behaving. It does not ask, what is this thing, but what does it do? It is essentially functional and behavioristic. And that's a quote from both Ashby in 1956 and then Umpleby in 2009. So it's kind of talking about the role of cybernetics. It's not about like identification, it's about function. And so that's kind of where we start about sort of the usefulness of cybernetics here. The artificial intelligence community currently operates with several competing framings of what a large language model is. It is variously described as a knowledge base, a reasoning engine, a stochastic parrot, and a foundation model. And again, these are just ways, I mean, they're not all kind of equivalent in terms of their, what they're actually describing. But I think the point here is that there are a lot of different ways we think about a large language model in terms of what is that thing. But they're all kind of not asking the question, what does it do? So each framing identifies a characteristic of large language models, but none them all, which means that any one description doesn't really capture the entirety of this functional relationship between the language model and the user. That is, the knowledge-based framing, for example, cannot explain hallucination, the confident generation of plausible but false information, except as a defect. So maybe, our view of hallucinations is wrong. Maybe that they're not defects, but there's something else, or something functionally distinct about that interaction. And so this is where we get into the idea of intelligence amplification and this closed-loop feedback between the user and the large language model. The reasoning engine framing cannot explain why identical logical problems yield different results depending on the superficial prompt variations. And this is what I was talking about earlier. But a lot of times, your result in a model depends on what you ask it. And if you ask it something and it generates a response and it looks great, but there are other things that it could have generated if you would sort of specify things differently. And that's true of like any modeling exercise where you want to build a model of something and you have sort of assumptions and you don't necessarily think about if you change those assumptions slightly, you end up with a different model, or you end up with the model generating different behaviors because you have these different specifications. So it's something to really kind of, again, we can't necessarily get at with the what is this thing perspective. The stochastic parrot framing cannot explain emergent capabilities that appear at scale without explicit training. And the foundation model framing is descriptive but not diagnostic. It tells us what the system does, which is adapt to tasks, without explaining why it succeeds or fails in the way it does. And so this just talks about why this article exists. The article advances 3 claims. The first is that the large language model realizes Beer's variety transducer abstraction. So again, Beer came up with this variety transducer idea, which is part of his viable systems model well before large language models existed, but it's still a thing, and we'll get into what a variety transducer is in a minute. And then Ashby's intelligence-amplifier is realized by the human large language model coupling, and that this framework has greater diagnostic and predictive power than the framings currently dominant. So a variety transducer is defined sort of as a, let's see, I'm trying to find the right place for this. Okay. So in terms of the variety transducer idea, so in Ashby's cybernetics, variety is the number of distinct states a system can occupy. So if you have, it's like kind of a Markov model where you have characterized, every state in the system. And sometimes you can predict all of those states. Sometimes they're hidden states that you have to discover. Sometimes they're states that exist but are inaccessible to your methods. So this is, but then again, having this variety is important, an important measure of complexity, because it tells us potentially how many different states a system can be in. So, it's easier to predict a system that can exist in 3 states rather than 200 states. And so this is something that is an important part of cybernetic regulation, because if you can't access all of the states that the system can be in, your model isn't very good. So if your system, you can think about this in terms of a training model as well, where if you train your model on very homogeneous data or very little data, you have a problem reproducing the variety of the real world. So you can't model the human language by giving it a small corpus of words. You have to give it a huge corpus that includes lots of instances of a word, lots of different meanings, etc. Now, a variety transducer is a mechanism that takes input variety from one system and transforms it, attenuating and amplifying to produce output variety shaped by its internal structure. So this was something that Beer developed for organizations, where variety management between systems and environments is the central regulatory problem. So, how do organizations deal with variety in the world, and how do they respond to change? A large language model takes input variety, in this case, tokens in a context window, the prompt, uploaded documents, search results, tool outputs, and transduces it through learned statistical structure, the parameters acquired during training, to produce output variety during generated tokens. The transduction is conditioned on the input but not determined by it. The same input can produce different outputs, depending on the temperature parameter, which regulates how much of the learned variety flows into the generation process. Okay, so then this point here about hallucination. Hallucination is not a bug in the knowledge base. It is the expected behavior of a variety transducer operating in regions of its variety space where the training signal is sparse, contradictory, or absent, where statistical regularities are weak, output variety is unconstrained, and the transducer generates plausible structured output without factual grounding. Again, it's this inability to sort of lock onto an instance, or you're asking the model to do something where it doesn't have the state available to it. And so it can't identify the state, and it fails. Okay. And then this just shows some examples of the intelligence amplifier, where you have this closed loop feedback system, but you also have things going on within these two boxes. So you have, of course, the human or the user has access to an internal model. They have access to the environment. You can ask a large language model something, you can get a response, but you can go and verify things. The same thing with a large language model. A large language model, you can train it. You can build a RAG, and you can train a large language model on very specific things. You can have a larger training set, and that can influence the large language model's response as well. So there's this adaptability on both sides here, and then you have this closed loop feedback, which is this closed loop interaction, or this interaction that relies on sort of a good prompt, but it also relies on a good representation of the problem space in the model. This is something we talked about in our paper on world models, in that you want to be able to build this model, and that it be complete enough to represent the system or the world that is the thing that maybe the user lives in. And so if the user is expecting something that maps cleanly to the world at large, or the system at large that they're prompted, they're maybe inquiring about or prompting the model to reproduce. And if the model isn't trained appropriately, it can't reproduce that output. But then we also added in this idea of the observer. And so this is second order cybernetics, where there's an observer that observes that interaction and then moderates that interaction. So there is another part of this that we're not talking about, which is the role of the observer. So could you have an intelligence amplifier with an observer? Yes, you could. That's what our world model does, which is it observes this interaction and it can fill in the gaps, provide a larger context to the large language model, but also to the user. And then this is the mapping here, where they specify there's this. Cybernetics always had its own notation, and the way they approach this is very, it's mathematical, but it's more symbolic logic. So the way they approach this is to have things spelled out in terms of parameter values. Now, for intelligence, Ashby often used the parameter G, which was, of course, the same thing that we use for general intelligence. So you're familiar with intelligence tests and things like that. Now, it doesn't need to be that sort of intelligence. You could have multiple intelligences, for example. You could have multiple measures of G, whatever that is. And then you could have just a general level of performance measurement. So you don't need to use, G is kind of vague in the sense that it means intelligence, not necessarily the sort of the instrument of generalized intelligence. It could be like a general intelligence. It could be like specific types of intelligences, or it could be expertise, or it could be some performance metric that's improved upon. There's this XS system, which is coupled. So X is the actual problem environment, which includes documents, code bases, organizations as they actually function, the world the user is trying to affect. So there's a lot in this variable that is kind of, they'll use a symbol. There's a lot underlying the symbol, a lot of constructs that need to be represented. But X is basically the problem environment. And then S is this large language model and a summation of its representation and output space. So again, X is kind of maybe the real world, and S is the model. And S needs to match X in terms of its states, the states that it can access. So if your S has very few, it's sparse in terms of states, and your X is very rich in states, then you get this sort of this representational aliasing, where you include a lot of things in the single states, or you sometimes break very common phenomena down into multiple states. And this can be a problem with this type of regulation because it's basically a misattribution error or a classification error. And so we try to sort of build models that have all of the components of our real world system. So if we're building a biological model, oftentimes we have to be very specific as to what we're modeling. Are we modeling the physical interactions? Are we modeling the morphology? Are we modeling gene expression, proteomics? We have to be very specific about what states are attained within that system. And then oftentimes our models are incomplete there. We might be interested in a very specific relationship, so we build a model with just those states. It helps us do things like simulation that are tractable, but it doesn't represent that whole system. It just represents our problem. So our model generally is not generalizable to the world. Now, with large language models, of course, the expectation is that's generalizable to the world. So having the proper number of states is important, but of course we can't know we can't have all of the states of the world incorporated into our model. So we just have to kind of figure out what the best representation is that we can use for this. So the channel G is the context, in this case, is the context window through which a representation reaches S. So this is this general intelligence. The mapping small g to these symbols is the test that produces the binary verdict, which is the threshold from the representation that arrives. G's context includes prompts, uploaded documents, search results, and tool outputs. Critically, G carries a lossy representation, not X itself. So this is where X is this actual problem environment. You get this lossy representation of the environment, meaning that you lose information within that representation, but it's a good approximation of X. So what S has to operate on is this lossy representation of X. So the lossy representation of epsilon, which is this representation here, and that's kind of how, you have to do that, I guess, because you just simply cannot make a full representation, a lossless representation. And then, of course, it talks about V here, which is this, it talks about autoregressive token generation, which is the internal mechanism inside one S step. Each turn is one application of S. Given the current context, the user's verdict, and per response sampling stochasticity of large V, which is I'm not sure. Anyways, this produces the next next value here, so the next context. Temperature tau regulates how much variety from V flows into small v. Low tau attenuates variety. High tau amplifies variety. So when we're talking about amplification or attenuation, we're talking about the variety. So we might be exploratory, we might be exploitative, we might have a deterministic system, we might have a stochastic system. So if we have a stochastic system, we need to amplify variety. If we have a deterministic system, we need to attenuate variety. If we want to exploit certain niches of knowledge, we attenuate variety. If we want to explore the world, we need to amplify variety. Large V is the training corpus and the representations learned from it, which is what I was looking for, large V. Basically, the training set and then the representations within. So, you might have different features within that training set, or the training corpus that is how the states are characterized. This is where the most consequential departure from Ashby's homeostat lies, which relied on random noise. So his original homeostat, which is a version of intelligence amplification, relied on random noise. So this is where you have a representation of the internal state called the homeostat. And the homeostat then basically does a sort of intelligence amplification, but does it with random noise. Yeah, it just talks more about Ashby and about some of this stuff. Modern V is structured variety, that is the statistical regularities of human language and knowledge, compressed through gradient descent, deep representations, and attention-based architectures in the model's parameters. The variety is still inexhaustible, so for example, novel outputs can be generated indefinitely, but it is not random. It carries structure. Large language models achieve amplification ratios incomparably higher than Ashby's original homeostat. That's pretty interesting, given that, well, we would expect that because the homeostat was a simple system. And I think Ashby actually implemented the homeostat in some mechanical devices like robots. But yeah, definitely expect a large language model to be more complex than the homeostat. So I think that's it for that paper. I don't know if we had any comments or questions about that. Looks like we have some, actually some comments from Kavya and then Morgan. what's the paper's title link? So the paper is, so we go back to the title here. The large language model is variety transducer. That's in the journal Kybernetes. And then this is the link here.
Hello. Can you hear
there
me?
you go. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. It's yeah, I switched over to the Linux workstation. Very interesting. I am, yeah, really curious, like whether, well, like I kind of only caught it as I was coming on the train. So I'd like to dig into it, but I can definitely see, some some good overlap in terms of, especially how, people have been talking about it, like, I mean, it does seem very close to that kind of 60s cybernetic vision where it's an augmentative device, and so yeah, like would be interested to follow up on that.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely like thinking about how this is a system. Of course, this is an interactive system. You have to have the human. I've seen people think about like the role of embodiment in large language models. I've seen a couple things at conferences where people have talked about that. I think that's a provocative term, but I think you could build a model of like at least of interaction where you say, there's this, it's not just that the large language model exists kind of on its own, but there's this interaction that exists between the user prompting the model responding to the user prompting it again, and then the outside world where you can verify things or you can specialize the training so that you have access to more specific information, more information, etc. So it's always about like the model tracking the real world. And sometimes, we have our own models of the real world, and we don't experience everything in the real world. So our own models are lossy with respect to knowing what the real world can offer, right? Like we have we build a model of the world in our minds. That model may have a certain number of states. Some of us say may have more states than others, but and then the real world has a lot more states that we've not experienced. We go to a different culture, for example. There are a lot of states there that we don't have access to until we see that place and experience that thing, and then we kind of interpret it in our own set of states, right? So that's a problem with human cognition, is that we're not necessarily amenable to those kind of state regional expansions where we gain states and we have to put it into a framework. I mean, we can do it, but we're not immediately adaptive in that way. I mean, the same thing holds true then for an artificial model. An artificial model has access to as many states as it's trained on, or as many states that can be extracted from the training data. Now you can train a model some more, but the question is, what do you train it on to get the answer you want? This is where regs come in, because we can do that. We can give it very specific information, but are we really giving it more state information? And then is that incorporated into the larger model of the world, basically? So this is where world models come in, where we need to have a world model for the world. We may not have like all of the state information for everything in the world, but if we have like a conceptual model of the world is this way, and we're fitting in pieces of the world with our training data, and we're kind of paneling the walls of the world model with training data, and then there are things that are missing, but we suspect that there are other cultures out there or other worlds. It's kind of like human exploration, right? Like we know maybe there's life on other planets, but we don't know what it looks like. We don't have that context yet. We don't have that information. But we have the mental model to say, okay, there probably is life on other planets. We don't know what it looks like. It could look like something on Earth. It might not. We don't have the state. And then once you get the state, did you put it into the right context, or do you just kind of you misinterpret it sometimes. You could interpret it as like, something you find on Earth when in fact it isn't at all anything like you'd find on Earth. Those sorts of things. Yeah, it's a really interesting kind of perspective on it.
I mean, I think this is why the benchmarking and the kind of things like Arc Challenge and other tests of these models are so important, right? Because it's like I think I know what you mean by world model, but I see it also, kind of like being a language term to represent this ideal without being concrete about well, especially what that means cognitively.
Right.
Like yeah, I know. It's like I yeah, like I think we all know, and how how did you separate it from its original implementations, where it was like a world, right? And you go back to kind of like that time period of spinning up in RL, and I'm trying to think the guy. Oh shoot. I should have this on the tip of my tongue, but Dreamer, the Dreamer model, right? So I think Dreamer was one of the early worlds, and and it was very much about understanding literally that world, right? Or yeah, it was kind of this embodiment thing, and yeah, but now it's also being used as a term to represent a particular kind of like passive models now.
Yeah.
And like how to, but at the end of the day, right, the most important thing, or the way in which we have to evaluate these, is again like how to make a test that shows that demonstrates this, right? And so again, like things like the Arc Challenge, things like the like Frontier Bench now, or like this is one of the most recent parts to the spinning up in mech interp that I've been focused on, which is like and some of this comes from Nathan Lampert, who I think had like reasoning bench or something. But you see the it's just like how it's like how do you do the evaluation to see what you're building, and which again also comes back to just again a valuable point is as I said, like we should watch the Emily Bender not talk, but kind of like interview weekly to remind us of a bunch of things. That it's easy to get lost in weeds and just remember that like intelligence is one of like the least. Intelligence is a very pragmatic concept.
Right. Yeah.
And certainly like a single entity intelligence, certainly. And then it's when we think of, again, like intelligence tests for humans, versus also kind of like I don't want to say common sense, but yeah, it's funny. Barshan had sent me a funny interaction with Claude, which I think is one of these things that people do, where it's like, what's the simplest question you can ask a frontier model and get a absolutely stunningly bad response, So he was asking about the I have a car, I need to wash it. The car wash is 100 meters away. Should I walk or should I drive, or something like that? And it's getting funny different answers from the model in terms of you should walk, you should drive. I forget who it was. I was also like asking every time. I think it was like Gary Marcus or something like that. Like every time a language model comes out, I always ask it to do some addition.
Yeah.
just just to, yeah. But it's but coming back to like the where the cybernetics people were thinking about, kind of thinking about the future. I think there is something wonderful about it, that you see more and more with these like AI scientists, where it's not so much. It is more like a research assistant, or it was funny. It was another example. We talked about the developer of pins at Brown, who created this SciML, agentic SciML, and he seemed to assign roles of the team of agents, like just like a PI in a research lab. Like it was very much like structured. It was structured like a lab. And then it was just like, and then you have the grad students who actually do the coding.
Yeah.
And it was funny because it's like the guy, I think it's like the original PyMC developer was talking on Twitter or LinkedIn or something, and he was saying that, like, again, saying he found it to be a very capable collaborator, and it was funny because he was just like, so I just think of it as like I'm directing a postdoc. It was funny how they all saw this like a mirror of their social hierarchies.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, it's again, I still think it's a valid. But it does speak to one thing. I know we got to go, but where it's just like when you're, because I think you were saying this a bit about your own experience coding. It's like you do need. I could see the postdoc bit where it's just like if I'm not doing the coding, how do I evaluate the work of this other person?
Right.
So I have to think about the tests and the benchmarks and the verifications and validations without trying to learn the 2,000 lines of code that this person has developed, right? Like that's not the good use of my time. I have to assume that generation is a sufficient source where I actually just need to think about these end goals. Anyway, it's a great subject. I would love to come back to I still haven't done the harness kind of work, like how some of the progress on our challenge has actually focused on harness changes, and you know, and I think that has something to do with some topics that were raised in this particular paper, which was like again, it's like I think the harness is saying when agents should go out and seek verification and like knowledge about the world, when they should switch to tools, when they should, you know, when they should really, you know, like checks and balances on their own, on themselves.
Yeah.
And I think, and you know, this is the bit where it's like I still feel like we're getting to the point where we're obviously going to move to multi-agent systems, where we will actually have some sort of, you know, society of agents, and you know, kind of like dividing up tasks and things like that. But yeah, and like wondering if this will come back around to some not necessarily the sustainability work, but certainly some work that requires the same kinds of like group management. Yeah.
Right.
So I'm kind of popping in here, but it's like I forget if where I mentioned this recently to Bradley or maybe in one of the messages or something, but there's like some multi-agent stuff. There's enough multi-agent stuff going on here in this lab, as Morgan saying, and one of the interns from Data and Direction, which I'm kind of out of time now, so I'll say it more next time. But basically, I'd like to make something that's like either eventually drafting some proposals for the fall, like to get some people to work on a project and like, or like spend some time maybe next time or next week or something. We spend some time organizing something about the multi-agent work here, just to kind of map it out that we're doing, or like there's so much stuff going on and it's all like kind of discrete right now, but like having some kind of a what are we doing, or what is there going on, or how could someone take something forward, because I don't know. So just basically further discussion on multi-agent and computational agent, or simulation, computer simulations in multi-agent sense, or not quite agent-based modeling, but multi-agent stuff to talk more about later. So I just wanted to pin that for next time, I guess.
Yeah, that's great. All right. Well, thank you for attending, and thanks for the conversation. I think it was pretty good things to follow up on. All right. Have a good week.
Take care.
Take care.